History doesn't repeat itself by accident. It repeats when we stop paying attention. Subscribe and leave a like if you want to understand how the world really entered World War II. Not myths, but facts. Let's begin. The origins of the Second World War. A historical narrative with analytical perspective. Aggression, appeasement, and the road to war, 1933 to 1939. By 1933, the international order created after the First World War was no longer merely fragile. It was openly crumbling. The rise of authoritarian regimes transformed dissatisfaction into action and resentment into ambition. What had once been political rhetoric now became state policy. The world was not drifting toward war by accident. It was being pushed there step by step, decision by decision, failure by failure. At the center of this transformation stood Nazi Germany. After consolidating power internally, Adolf Hitler turned his attention outward. His goals were ambitious, ideological, and dangerously clear. Overturn the Treaty of Versailles, restore Germany's military strength, unite all ethnic Germans under one state, and acquire living space through expansion. These aims were presented not as aggression, but as historical correction and national destiny. The first test came in 1935, when Germany openly violated the Treaty of Versailles by reintroducing conscription and expanding its armed forces. The reaction from Britain and France was limited to diplomatic protests. No sanctions followed. No military response was considered. This moment was critical. It demonstrated that the post-war rules existed largely on paper. Encouraged by this passivity, Hitler moved further. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone meant to serve as a buffer between Germany and France. Militarily, this was a gamble. German forces had orders to retreat if confronted. Politically, it was a triumph. France hesitated. Britain urged restraint. The League of Nations did nothing. The gamble paid off, and Hitler's confidence grew. This period also witnessed the tightening of alliances among authoritarian states. In Italy, Benito Mussolini pursued his own imperial ambitions. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 was a blatant act of aggression, met with weak sanctions that failed to stop the campaign. Italy learned the same lesson as Germany. International condemnation carried little real cost. Meanwhile, in Spain, the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, became a rehearsal for a larger conflict. Germany and Italy supported nationalist forces, while the Soviet Union backed the opposing side. Britain and France, fearing escalation, remained largely neutral. The war exposed the ideological divisions tearing Europe apart and demonstrated the growing effectiveness of modern warfare, including aerial bombardment of civilian targets. In Asia, aggression followed a similar pattern. Japan expanded deeper into China after 1937, committing widespread atrocities while facing limited international resistance. Once again, the global system failed to enforce its own principles. The message was unmistakable. Power, not law, dictated outcomes. Despite these warning signs, Britain and France remained committed to a policy that would later be known as appeasement. Haunted by the memory of the First World War and burdened by economic weakness, their leaders believed that reasonable concessions could satisfy revisionist demands and preserve peace. Hitler skillfully exploited this mindset, presenting each new demand as his last. The most dramatic example came in 1938 with the crisis over Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a significant German-speaking population. Rather than defend a sovereign state, Britain and France agreed to negotiations. The result was the Munich Agreement, which handed the territory to Germany without Czechoslovakia's participation. For a brief moment, Europe breathed a sigh of relief. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home declaring, "Peace for our time." In reality, Munich marked the final collapse of collective security. It confirmed that treaties could be ignored, borders redrawn, and smaller nations sacrificed in the hope of delaying war. Hitler did not delay. In March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that his ambitions extended far beyond uniting ethnic Germans. Appeasement had failed completely. Britain and France finally recognized that war was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching rapidly. In response, they offered guarantees to Poland, whose independence now stood in direct danger. Yet even this last effort at deterrence was undermined by division and mistrust. Negotiations with the Soviet Union stalled, while Germany pursued its own strategy to avoid a two-front war. The result was one of the most shocking diplomatic maneuvers of the era, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in August 1939. Two ideologically opposed regimes agreed to neutrality and secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The pact removed Hitler's final obstacle. By the summer of 1939, the path to war was clear. The international system had failed to stop aggression. Appeasement had encouraged expansion. Alliances had hardened. Military preparations were complete. What remained was a single decisive act that would transform tension into open conflict. The world stood on the edge. One invasion would be enough to push it over. The origins of the Second World War. A historical narrative with analytical perspective via September 1939 and the final collapse of peace. By late summer 1939, Europe existed in a state of tense anticipation. Diplomatic language still spoke of negotiations and restraint, but behind closed doors, governments prepared for the inevitable. The illusion of peace remained, yet it was no longer sustained by hope, only by denial. The final barriers that had delayed war were collapsing one by one. At the center of this final stage stood Poland, a nation reborn after the First World War and strategically positioned between two expanding powers. For Adolf Hitler, Poland was both an ideological target and a geopolitical obstacle. The demands began with familiar language, claims over Danzig, calls for territorial corrections, and accusations of mistreatment of ethnic Germans. But behind these demands lay a clear intention: conquest. In the weeks leading up to September, Germany intensified its preparations. Propaganda portrayed Poland as the aggressor. False incidents were staged to justify military action. The narrative of self-defense was carefully constructed, despite the overwhelming reality that the decision for war had already been made. On September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. The invasion was swift, coordinated, and devastating. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moved with unprecedented speed in what would later be known as blitzkrieg. Cities were bombed, communication lines were severed, and civilian populations were thrown into chaos. The conflict that had been predicted, delayed, and feared had finally begun. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Their declarations marked the official beginning of the Second World War in Europe. Yet the response was cautious and restrained. While war was declared, immediate large-scale military action did not follow. The world had crossed the point of no return, but the full scale of the catastrophe was not yet visible. The tragedy deepened on September 17, 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland, acting in accordance with the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Poland was crushed from both sides. Within weeks, its government collapsed, its territory divided, and its people subjected to occupation, repression, and terror. The destruction of Poland symbolized the complete failure of the interwar system. Beyond Europe, the implications were immediate. The invasion confirmed what years of aggression had already suggested. International agreements without enforcement were meaningless. The League of Nations, effectively irrelevant, faded into obscurity. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly toward conflict. The outbreak of war in 1939 was not an accident, nor was it unavoidable. It was the result of choices made by leaders who underestimated ambition, overestimated compromise, and ignored warning signs. Economic desperation, political extremism, and ideological hatred had combined to create a world where violence once again seemed acceptable, even necessary. The Second World War did not begin simply because one nation invaded another. It began because the foundations of peace had been systematically eroded. Each violation left unanswered, each act of aggression met with hesitation, and each concession made in the name of stability pushed the world closer to collapse. By the time war was declared, the mechanisms designed to prevent it were already broken. What followed would be a conflict unlike any before, global in scale, industrial in nature, and catastrophic in human cost. Entire societies would be mobilized, cities erased, and millions of lives lost. September 1939 marked the end of the illusion that peace could survive without strength, unity, and accountability. It was the moment when history moved from warning to consequence. The world had failed to stop the path to war, and once the war began, there would be no turning back.